It was just past midnight when Sarah first saw it, the silhouette of a figure standing in the window of the house across the street. She had been sitting in her living room, scrolling mindlessly through her phone, trying to shake off the unease that had been creeping up on her all evening. The feeling was inexplicable, a tight knot of anxiety twisting in her gut for reasons she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the emptiness of the night, or perhaps the cold autumn wind that howled through the trees, making the branches claw at her window like skeletal fingers. Whatever it was, it had made her restless. When she looked up, her heart skipped a beat. Across the street, on the second floor of the house that had been vacant for over a year, stood a figure. Motionless, its form dark and hazy against the glass. The figure seemed to be staring directly at her, though the details were too blurred by the shadows for her to make out its features. Sarah's throat tightened, and for a moment, she froze, unsure if her eyes were playing tricks on her. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and glanced again. The figure was still there, watching. She told herself it had to be a trick of the light. The house across the street, an old colonial-style building, had been empty for months. The previous owners, an elderly couple, had moved away after the husband passed, leaving the place abandoned and decaying. Occasionally, teenagers would sneak in for a thrill, but Sarah hadn't seen any sign of life in that house in a long time. Surely this was just her imagination, but the longer she stared, the more real it seemed. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, and didn't break its gaze. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, a cold sweat forming on the back of her neck. She tore her eyes away from the window and grabbed her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen, debating whether to call someone. Who though? The police? What would she even say? That someone was standing in the window of an empty house? Taking a deep breath, she decided to check if any of her neighbors had noticed anything unusual. Maybe someone else had seen the figure too. She texted Emily, her friend who lived just a few doors down, asking if she had noticed anything strange. Emily's response came back quickly. What do you mean? That house has been empty forever. Are you okay? Sarah frowned. She glanced out the window again, but the figure was gone. Had she imagined it? She felt a rush of embarrassment and relief at the same time. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. After all, it had been a long, stressful week at work. Sleep deprivation could do that, couldn't it? She tried to laugh it off, but the lingering unease stayed with her, making her skin crawl. That night, Sarah barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of the figure standing in that window burned into her mind. She could still feel its gaze, its presence watching her, even when she knew it couldn't be real. The next morning, she told herself she had just been tired. A bad dream, nothing more. But as evening approached and the sky turned a bruised purple, she felt the same anxiety rising again. She found herself standing by the window, staring at the house across the street, waiting. As the clock neared midnight, she saw it again. The same figure, standing in the window, motionless, its form barely discernible in the darkness. Sarah's heart raced. She took a step back, fear tightening in her chest. It was real, she was sure of it now. But why was no one else seeing it? She rushed to her front door, yanked it open, and stepped onto her porch. The cold night air bit at her skin, but she didn't care. She needed to see if anyone else in the neighborhood had noticed. The street was eerily quiet. Not a single light was on in any of the other houses. No signs of life, no movement. She felt alone, as though the world around her had been swallowed by silence. When she glanced back at the window across the street, the figure was gone again. Sarah's mind raced with questions. Was she going crazy? Was this some kind of sick prank? She decided to go next door and knock on her neighbor, Mr. Harris's door. He had lived in the neighborhood for decades and knew everything about everyone. If something strange was happening, he would know. It took a few knocks before Mr. Harris answered, looking groggy and annoyed. "What is it, Sarah?" "It's late," he grumbled, squinting at her through the screen door. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Harris," she stammered, trying to keep her voice steady. "But have you seen anyone over at the old Miller house across the street?" He frowned, rubbing his temples as though she had asked a stupid question. "That place has been empty for over a year, you know that. No one's there. Why?" "I thought I saw someone standing in the window," Sarah said. her voice faltering as the words came out. Saying it aloud made it sound even more absurd. Mr. Harris shook his head. "There's no one there, Sarah. You're probably just seeing shadows or something. You should get some sleep." With that, he closed the door, leaving Sarah standing alone in the cold. She returned to her house, more confused than ever. If no one else could see the figure, did that mean it wasn't real? Or was it something only she could see? Something meant for her alone? Sarah tried to brush off the thoughts, but as she climbed into bed, her mind wouldn't stop racing. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, seemed amplified, like a distant whisper in her ear. When she finally drifted off into a restless sleep, her dreams were filled with the same haunting image. The figure at the window, its empty gaze locked on her. And deep down she knew, it was only the beginning. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of paranoia and sleepless nights. Every evening as the sky darkened, Sarah found herself glued to the window, staring at the house across the street. The figure appeared each night like clockwork, always at the same time, always standing in the same spot. Motionless. Staring. No one else saw it. She had asked everyone, Emily, Mr. Harris, even the mailman who passed by during the day. The responses were always the same. "That house is empty, Sarah. You're imagining things." But Sarah knew what she saw. She wasn't crazy. Yet as the days wore on, she began to doubt her own sanity. Was it possible she was losing her mind? The figure never moved, never showed any sign of life beyond its looming presence. But its stillness was worse than movement. It was as if it were waiting for something, waiting for her. One night, Sarah decided she couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. She was going to the house. The thought filled her with dread, but the uncertainty was worse. She couldn't live like this, always looking over her shoulder, always feeling watched. She had to know the truth, even if it terrified her. The air was biting cold when she stepped out onto her porch, wrapping her coat tightly around her body. The street was quiet, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the streetlights. Her heart pounded in her chest as she crossed the road, her eyes fixed on the darkened house ahead. The figure was there, as it always was, standing in the window on the second floor, watching her approach. She stopped at the foot of the driveway, her breath coming out in ragged, visible puffs. The house loomed before her, its windows dark and lifeless except for that one, the one with the figure. A shiver ran down her spine, but she forced herself to keep moving. The front door was locked, of course, but Sarah had anticipated that. She walked around to the back, where the wooden fence had rotted away in several places, allowing easy access. The back door creaked as she pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty house like a groan of warning. Inside, the house was exactly as she had imagined. Cold, decaying, forgotten. Dust clung to every surface, and the air smelled of mold and neglect. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally in the silence as she moved through the rooms, her eyes darting to every shadow, every corner, half expecting the figure to be waiting for her around each turn. But the house was empty, devoid of life. Sarah made her way upstairs, her heart thudding louder with each step. The second floor was even colder than the first, the air thick with an oppressive stillness that made her feel like she was being suffocated. She paused outside the door to the room with the window where the figure had stood every night. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. It was locked. She hadn't expected that. The rest of the house had been open, so why was this door locked? Her pulse quickened, panic creeping in around the edges of her mind. Was she wrong? Was someone really in there? She rattled the knob, desperately trying to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, she took a step back and kicked the door with all her strength. The wood splintered and the door swung open with a deafening crack. The room was empty. Sarah stood there, panting, her chest tight with fear and confusion. The window was there, the one she had seen every night from across the street. But there was no one in the room. No figure, no sign of life, just dust and shadows. She approached the window slowly, her reflection staring back at her from the glass. Her heart raced as she looked out, expecting, hoping to see something, anything that would explain the figure she had seen. But all she saw was her own house, dark and quiet, across the street. And then it hit her. The figure hadn't been standing in the window of the house across the street. It had been standing in her window. Sarah stumbled backward, her mind reeling. The figure. It had been inside her house all along, watching her from the shadows of her own home. The realization made her stomach lurch, a wave of nausea and terror washing over her. She had been watching herself from across the street, every night, without even knowing it. A sudden noise from downstairs snapped her out of her daze, a creak, like the sound of someone moving. Her heart froze. She wasn't alone in the house. Someone, something, was here with her. She bolted from the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway as she ran for the stairs. But the house felt different now, the air thick with something dark and malevolent. Every shadow seemed to pulse with life, watching her, waiting for her. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating her as she raced toward the front door. But when she reached the bottom of the stairs, she stopped dead in her tracks. The front door was open, and standing in the doorway was the figure. It was no longer just a shadow. It was real, solid, its features now visible in the dim light. The figure was a woman, pale and gaunt, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight through Sarah. Her lips were cracked, twisted into a grotesque smile. Sarah backed away, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The woman took a step forward, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. "You've been watching me," the woman whispered, her voice raspy, almost mechanical. "Now it's time for me to watch you." Sarah turned and ran. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed to get away. But no matter how fast she ran, the house seemed to stretch on forever, the walls warping and bending around her. The woman's footsteps were behind her now, slow and deliberate, always just a few steps behind. Sarah burst through a door, finding herself in her own living room. She spun around, but the house was empty again. The woman was gone. Everything was quiet. But she knew the truth now. The figure wasn't just in the house across the street. It wasn't just watching her from afar. It was inside her. It had always been inside her, and it wasn't going to leave. Lily had always been careful. Living alone in a small apartment in the heart of the city, she had developed certain routines to ensure her safety. Every night before bed, she would double-check the lock on her door, making sure it was secured, as if it were a ritual. Click. The reassuring sound always gave her a sense of control over her space, a sanctuary from the chaotic world outside. Her apartment was a modest studio, sparsely furnished, with an open-plan design that made the space feel both cozy and claustrophobic at times. The walls were painted a pale, almost sickly green, and the single window overlooked the alleyway behind the building, where the dim light of a street lamp barely penetrated the shadows. She had always felt a strange kind of comfort in the small, enclosed environment. It was hers, safe, private. At least, that's what she had thought. The first time it happened, Lily brushed it off as nothing more than absent-mindedness. She had woken up to find her front door slightly ajar, the deadbolt undone. Her heart had raced for a moment, a pang of panic shooting through her, but then she convinced herself that she must have forgotten to lock it before falling asleep. She had been studying late the night before, her mind heavy with academic stress, so it wasn't impossible. Sleep deprivation could play tricks on the brain. But it happened again the next night, and again the night after that. Each time, Lily was certain she had locked the door, but every morning she found it open. A crack of darkness spilling into her apartment from the hallway. The first few times she tried to ignore it. She told herself it was her imagination, or perhaps a faulty lock. But the gnawing sense of unease grew stronger with each passing day. After a week of waking to the same terrifying sight, her door, always open, always unlocked, Lily's nerves were frayed. She could no longer ignore the creeping fear that had burrowed into her mind. Something was wrong, and she needed to find out what it was. At night, she found herself lying in bed, listening to every creak, every rustle of the wind, wondering if it was something more sinister. The silence of the apartment, once comforting, now felt oppressive, like it was hiding something. Every shadow seemed to flicker with hidden intent. She began sleeping with her phone in hand, waking up every few hours to check the door. And every time she did, it was open again. It wasn't long before Lily's sleep became a series of restless naps, punctuated by fear. The exhaustion weighed on her, and she found it harder to focus on her studies. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. The thought began to consume her, and her anxiety spiraled into paranoia. Finally, she decided to take action. She installed a small security camera in her living room facing the front door. It was a simple device, one that synced with her phone, allowing her to view the footage in real time or review it the next morning. If there was any logical explanation for what was happening, the camera would capture it. The first night after installing the camera, Lily locked the door, checked the deadbolt 3 times, and went to bed with a sense of uneasy anticipation. Her mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps she had simply been sleepwalking, or maybe it was some kind of bizarre mechanical malfunction with the door. But deep down, a more primal fear gnawed at her. That night, she didn't sleep at all. She lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the dim glow of her phone screen as she waited for the camera to show something, anything. Hours passed, and the only sound was the low hum of the city outside, punctuated by the occasional clattering of distant footsteps or the faint siren of a police car. But her phone remained silent, the camera feed still. It was almost dawn when exhaustion finally claimed her. Lily's eyes fluttered shut, and she drifted into a fitful sleep. When she awoke the next morning, her heart sank. The door was open again. This time, the gap was wider than before, almost as if someone had forgotten to close it entirely. With trembling hands, she grabbed her phone and opened the security app, dreading what she might find. The footage began normally. She watched herself lock the door and turn off the lights before heading to bed. For the first few hours, nothing happened. The apartment was quiet, still, the only movement coming from the occasional shift of shadows as cars passed by outside. But then, around 2:30 a.m., the camera captured something. The door, which had been locked, slowly creaked open. Lily's blood ran cold as she watched the scene unfold. The door didn't open all at once. It inched forward, almost cautiously, as if whoever was behind it was trying not to make a sound. Then a figure appeared in the doorway. It was a man. He stood there, motionless, just inside the threshold, his face obscured by the shadows. He was tall, his shoulders hunched slightly, as if to make himself smaller, less noticeable. For what felt like an eternity, the man didn't move. He just stood there, staring in the direction of Lily's bedroom, his head tilted ever so slightly, as though he were listening for something. Lily's breath caught in her throat as she continued to watch the footage, unable to tear her eyes away. After several minutes of standing in silence, the man took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't turn on any lights, didn't make a sound, but he moved with purpose, like he had done this before. He walked past the camera, disappearing from view for a moment. Lily's heart raced as she realized he must have been standing right outside her bedroom door. She fast-forwarded through the footage, her hands shaking. When the man reappeared, he was leaving, quietly closing the door behind him. Lily's mind went blank. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. This man, this stranger, had been in her apartment, watching her as she slept. He hadn't taken anything, hadn't harmed her, but the violation was worse than she could have imagined. The thought of him standing there, so close, filled her with a terror she had never known. She immediately called the police, her voice shaking as she explained what had happened. They arrived within minutes, questioning her and reviewing the footage. But there was little they could do. The man had left no trace, no fingerprints, and they had no idea who he was or how he had managed to enter her apartment without breaking the lock. That night, Lily didn't sleep at all. She sat on her couch, her eyes glued to the camera feed, waiting for the man to return. The days that followed were a blur of fear and exhaustion. The police promised to increase patrols around the area, but it brought Lily little comfort. Every night she stayed up late watching the camera feed, her heart pounding with every creak and groan of the old building. She barely left her apartment, too terrified to step outside, yet equally terrified to stay within those walls. Her once safe haven had become a prison of paranoia. Her friends noticed her withdrawal. Emily, her closest friend, tried to convince her to move out, to stay with her for a while, but Lily couldn't bring herself to leave. She needed answers. She needed to know why this man had chosen her, why he entered her apartment every night just to watch her sleep, days turned into weeks, and though the man didn't return, the fear remained, a constant weight on her chest. She started to experience vivid nightmares, dreams where she woke up to find the man standing at the foot of her bed, his eyes gleaming in the dark. In the dreams, he would reach out to touch her, but she was always frozen, unable to scream, unable to move. One night, unable to take the silence any longer, Lily decided to dig deeper. She spent hours online, searching for any information she could find about break-ins or stalkers in her area. But what she discovered was far more disturbing. The man in her footage wasn't a stranger. Scrolling through old news articles, she found a name, Marcus Holloway. A photo of him accompanied the article. The man was older now, but the resemblance was unmistakable. Marcus had been a handyman in the building years ago, before Lily had moved in. According to the article, he had been obsessed with a woman who had lived in Lily's apartment before her. The woman, Jessica, had mysteriously disappeared one night, and Marcus had been the prime suspect. But there had never been enough evidence to arrest him. The case went cold. Lily felt a chill run down her spine as she stared at the screen. Marcus had been watching Jessica, just as he had been watching her. Was it possible that he had returned to finish what he had started? But why her? Why now? Suddenly, a memory surfaced, something she had forgotten until now. When she first moved into the apartment, she had found an old journal tucked away in the back of a closet. It had belonged to Jessica. Lily had only skimmed through it at the time, finding it filled with mundane entries about daily life. But now she wondered if it held some clue. She dug out the journal from the back of her dresser and began reading. At first, the entries were ordinary, just like she remembered. But as she reached the final pages, Jessica's tone changed. She wrote about feeling watched, about waking up to find her door open in the middle of the night. The last entry was short, frantic. "He's here. He watches me while I sleep. I know he's coming for me." Lily dropped the journal, her heart hammering in her chest. Jessica had known. She had felt the same fear, the same helplessness, and now it was happening all over again. Lily's phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. It was a notification from the security app. Movement detected. Her blood turned to ice. She grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she'd opened the app. The live feed from the camera showed her apartment just as it always did. But this time, the door was wide open, and standing in the doorway was Marcus. Lily's breath caught in her throat as she watched him step inside, his movements slow and deliberate, just like before. But this time, he wasn't just watching. He was coming for her. Panic surged through her. She grabbed the phone and dialed 911, her voice barely a whisper as she begged for help. But Marcus was already in the apartment, moving toward her bedroom. She backed away, her mind racing. There was no way out. She was trapped. As Marcus reached the doorway to her room, his face finally came into view. His eyes were cold, empty, devoid of any emotion. He smiled, a slow, sinister grin that sent a wave of nausea through her. "You remind me of her," he said softly, his voice a chilling whisper. "Jessica." Lily's vision blurred with tears as she pressed herself against the wall, her body shaking. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Marcus stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch her face. Just as his fingers brushed her skin, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Marcus froze, his head snapping toward the window. The police were coming. Without a word, he turned and fled, disappearing into the night. Lily collapsed to the floor, gasping for air as the weight of the moment crashed down on her. The police arrived moments later, but Marcus was already gone, slipping away like a shadow in the darkness. Though he was gone, the fear remained. Marcus had been watching her for weeks, maybe longer, and now she knew the truth. It wasn't just a random break-in. He had chosen her, and she knew, deep down, that he would be back. The nightmare was far from over. It was a gray, drizzly afternoon in the small town of Ravensbrück, nestled in the rural outskirts of New England. The weather seemed to reflect the state of mind of Elise Carter, a young woman in her late 20s, whose heart felt heavy with a mixture of curiosity and melancholy. She had just moved to this quaint but somber town in search of a fresh start after the end of a tumultuous relationship. Her new home was a Victorian-era house, sprawling and grand, yet shadowed by years of neglect and silence. Elise's life had become a series of routines, filled with the mundane activities of unpacking and decorating her new space. On one particularly dreary day, as she roamed the town's antique district, she stumbled upon a small, dimly lit shop nestled between a bookstore and a coffee house. The store, with its cracked windows and peeling paint, seemed to beckon her in. Above the door, a faded sign read, "Harris & Co. Antiques." Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged wood and dust. Shelves and tables overflowed with items from bygone eras, faded photographs, tarnished silverware, and trinkets that whispered of forgotten lives. Elise wandered through the labyrinth of objects, each piece holding a story she could only guess at. It was then that she saw it, a doll, perched on a high shelf behind the counter. The doll was unlike any she had ever seen. It had porcelain skin, delicate and cracked with age, and a head of golden curls that framed its unsettlingly lifelike face. Its eyes were an eerie shade of blue, almost too bright against the pallor of its skin. The doll's clothing was a frilly, old-fashioned dress, tattered and yellowed with time. Something about the doll drew Elise in. She found herself mesmerized by its vacant stare. She approached the counter where the shopkeeper, an elderly man with a gaunt face and sharp, penetrating eyes, noticed her interest. "Beautiful, isn't she?" the shopkeeper said in a voice that seemed to scrape the air. "That doll's been here for as long as I can remember." Elise's fingers brushed against the porcelain as she carefully lifted the doll from its perch. A shiver ran down her spine, but she brushed it aside, attributing it to the chilly air of the shop. "How much for it?" Elise asked, her voice a touch more eager than she intended. The shopkeeper's eyes glinted with something unreadable. "For you, dear, it's a mere $100. Elise hesitated, but felt an inexplicable urge to possess the doll. She paid for it and wrapped it carefully in the provided paper. As she left the store, the sky darkened and the drizzle turned into a steady rain. Elise clutched the parcel tightly, feeling as if she was carrying not just a doll, but an entire history with her. Back at her Victorian home, Elise placed the doll on a wooden shelf in her bedroom. The room, though beautifully decorated, took on a colder, more foreboding air with the doll in it. Elise tried to shake off her unease and settled into her new life, but the doll seemed to occupy her thoughts incessantly. As the night fell, Elise lay in bed, but sleep eluded her. She found herself drawn to the doll's presence, its eyes seemingly following her every movement. When she finally drifted off, her sleep was plagued with strange dreams, visions of dark, foreboding places and a child's tearful face. The following days were marked by a growing sense of disquiet. Elise tried to ignore the doll, but it was as though the presence within it was determined to make itself known. Odd occurrences began to disturb the peace of her home. Items would go missing, only to reappear in strange places. Elise heard whispers in the dead of night and felt an inexplicable coldness that seemed to seep from the very walls. One evening, as Elise was in the kitchen preparing dinner, she heard the faint sound of a child's laughter echoing through the house. She froze, the knife in her hand slipping from her grip. The sound was fleeting, almost as if it had come from a distant dream, but it left her feeling unsettled. She searched the house, finding nothing out of the ordinary. That night, Elise's sleep was again interrupted by nightmares. She saw the doll in her dreams, but it was no longer merely a porcelain figure. It was alive, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The doll's mouth moved, forming words Elise could not understand, but that filled her with an overwhelming sense of dread. In her dreams, the doll beckoned her to follow it to a shadowy, damp basement filled with broken toys and whispers of anguish. Upon waking, Elise was drenched in sweat. She decided to do some research about the doll, hoping to uncover its origins and perhaps find an explanation for the strange happenings. Her search led her to an old newspaper archive detailing a tragic event that had occurred in Ravensbrück decades earlier. The article recounted the story of a young girl named Emily who had been brutally murdered in the late 1940s. Her body had been discovered in a dilapidated house not far from Elise's own home. The doll, it turned out, was once Emily's, an heirloom passed down through her family. As Elise delved deeper into the history, she uncovered a grim detail. Emily's spirit was said to be restless, seeking vengeance for her untimely death. The more Elise learned, the more she felt the oppressive weight of Emily's anger and sorrow. One evening, Elise returned home to find her house unusually quiet. As she approached her bedroom, she noticed the doll was no longer on its shelf. Panic surged through her as she searched the house, her heart racing. Finally, she found the doll in the basement, seated in the middle of the floor, its eyes glowing ominously in the dim light. The air in the basement was thick with an oppressive silence, and Elise could feel the temperature drop. A sense of foreboding filled the space. She moved closer to the doll, trying to steady her breath, but the moment her hand reached out to grab it, the lights flickered and went out. Elise stumbled in the dark, her breath coming in ragged gasps. In the darkness, Elise heard a child's voice, faint but clear. It was Emily's voice, pleading and sorrowful. Elise felt a cold, ghostly touch on her arm, sending a jolt of terror through her. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and Elise could no longer distinguish where the voices were coming from. When the lights finally came back on, Elise was alone in the basement. The doll was still there, its eyes fixed on her with an unblinking gaze. Elise's fear turned into a resolute determination to confront whatever was haunting her. She decided to seek help from a local historian who specialized in the town's dark past. The historian, a middle-aged man named Samuel Price, was intrigued by Elise's account. He agreed to help her, sharing more about Emily's tragic story. Samuel revealed that Emily had been the daughter of a wealthy family, but her life had ended in horror. The case had remained unsolved, with whispers of supernatural elements surrounding it. Samuel suggested that Elise perform a ritual to appease Emily's restless spirit. He provided her with a detailed guide on how to conduct the ritual and warned her of the potential dangers. Elise felt a sense of desperation mixed with hope. She prepared for the ritual with a mix of fear and determination. The night of the ritual, Elise set up a small altar in the basement, placing candles, incense, and Emily's doll at the center. She followed Samuel's instructions precisely, chanting the words meant to soothe the spirit and offer peace. The air in the basement grew heavy as Elise performed the ritual, her hands trembling as she held the doll. As the final chant echoed through the basement, the temperature dropped sharply, and a gust of wind extinguished the candles. Elise felt a presence, a powerful force that seemed to swirl around her. The whispers grew into a cacophony of voices, crying out in anguish and anger. Elise clung to the hope that the ritual would bring solace to the tormented spirit. In a sudden, violent burst, the basement was illuminated by a blinding light. Elise was thrown back against the wall, and the doll flew across the room, shattering into pieces. The presence in the basement felt as though it was dissipating, leaving behind an eerie stillness. When Elise recovered, she found herself alone in the dark, the remnants of the doll scattered around her. The basement was silent, and the oppressive weight that had hung over her seemed to have lifted. Elise, exhausted and shaken, felt a fleeting sense of relief. The haunting presence had disappeared, leaving behind only the remnants of the shattered doll and a lingering sense of dread. Elise's life slowly returned to normal, but the memory of the doll and the haunting experiences stayed with her. She remained in Ravensbrook, but the town's dark history and the echoes of the doll's spirit continued to linger in her mind. The Victorian house, once a symbol of new beginnings, now stood as a reminder of the darkness that lay hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. As Elise looked at the empty space where the doll had once been, she couldn't help but wonder if the spirit of Emily had truly found peace, or if the echoes of the past would forever haunt her dreams. I moved into the house on a cold, overcast day. The clouds hung low, almost suffocating the streets beneath them. My first impression of the neighborhood was that it felt frozen. Not by the weather, but by something unseen, something crawling beneath the surface, waiting to rise. The houses were old, their paint chipped, and windows covered with dust that had settled for years, as if the residents inside hadn't bothered to look out in a long time. The house I had bought stood at the edge of the street, isolated from the others by a wild, untended garden. Its dark wooden exterior was warped from decades of weathering, and the windows, half covered by grime, barely reflected the dim sunlight. Yet there was something about this place that drew me to it. A kind of forgotten beauty, perhaps, or the mystery that lingered in its shadows. It felt like a place that had stories to tell, if only I listened carefully. The previous owner had passed away, and from what little I gathered, it had been sudden. The neighborhood was quiet about it, but I could sense the unease whenever I mentioned his name. Something about him disturbed them. Perhaps it was just the way small towns talk about their oddest residents, or perhaps something more. On my first night, as I lay in bed, I became aware of the stillness. Not the peaceful kind, but the oppressive sort that seemed to press down on my chest. I closed my eyes, willing sleep to take me, but then I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. It was subtle at first, as though someone was hesitantly tapping on the front door, afraid to be heard. I hesitated. It was late, far too late for anyone to visit. The house creaked and groaned in the wind, but this wasn't just the house settling. The knock came again, louder this time. I slipped out of bed, my heart thudding in my chest. Every step I took toward the door felt like wading through thick fog, my legs heavy with dread. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the cold metal knob. I took a deep breath and opened it. No one. The night outside was thick with mist, so dense that it seemed to swallow the world beyond the small porch light. The air was wet and cold, and the silence unbearable. I glanced down, and there, on the wooden floor of the porch, were footprints. Muddy, human-shaped footprints, leading up to the door and stopping just in front of me. I shut the door quickly, bolting it behind me. My hands were trembling, and my mind raced. Was it just someone playing a prank? But who would walk through the mud in the dead of night, only to disappear? The next morning, I checked the porch again. The footprints were gone, washed away by the early morning rain, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something. A nagging sensation crawled at the back of my mind, a voice whispering that this was just the beginning. Days passed, and I tried to settle into the routine of life in the new house, but the sense of being watched never left me. The neighbors avoided my eyes when we crossed paths. They spoke in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders, as though afraid of being overheard by someone, something. One day, an old woman, her face lined with years of hardship, approached me. She was hesitant, her eyes darting nervously to the house behind me. "You live there now?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He used to live there, you know." I nodded. "Yes, the previous owner. I've heard." She shook her head. No, him." I stared at her, confused. "Who?" "The old man," she continued, her voice trembling. "The one who lived next door. He died years ago, but some say he never left. They say he comes back at night looking for something. He always did keep to himself, never liked the new folks moving in." Her eyes bore into mine, filled with a mix of fear and pity. I tried to shake off her words as nothing more than superstition, the kind of gossip that spreads in isolated towns. But the unease gnawed at me, especially when the knocking started again. Knock, knock, knock. Every night it came, and every night I opened the door to find no one there. Yet each morning I'd discover the same muddy footprints, leading up to the door and stopping just short of the threshold. It was starting to mess with my mind. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, like invisible eyes were fixed on me from the shadows. I began hearing whispers in the house, faint at first, but growing louder as the nights went on. They were unintelligible, like someone speaking through water, but I could sense the malice behind them. One night, I decided to stay up and wait for the knocking. I sat in the dark living room, my hands gripping the armrests of the chair, my eyes fixed on the front door. Hours passed, and just as I was about to give up, I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. The sound echoed through the silence, and my heart leapt into my throat. I jumped to my feet, flung open the door, and once again, nothing. The same thick mist, the same silence. But this time, something was different. There, standing in the middle of the yard, was a figure. A tall, gaunt man, dressed in ragged clothes, his face obscured by the fog. He was staring straight at me, though I couldn't make out his eyes. I froze, my breath caught in my chest. For a moment, time seemed to stop, and then he was gone, disappeared into the mist as if he had never been there. I slammed the door shut, bolting it once more. My mind raced, the lines between reality and nightmare blurring. Had I really seen him? Or was this just my mind unraveling, lost in the paranoia of the house? The footprints were there again the next morning, more defined this time, as though whoever or whatever was responsible was getting closer. The following night, the knocking was louder. Knock, knock, knock. It pounded like a heartbeat through the walls, relentless. I lay in bed, drenched in sweat, paralyzed by the growing terror that seemed to seep from every corner of the house. This time, I didn't get up to answer the door. I stayed in bed, blankets pulled up to my chin like a child hiding from a nightmare. But the knocking continued, insistent, demanding. I was no longer alone in this house. I never thought I would be haunted by my own memories. It all started innocently, like any other ordinary day. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, the sky gray and overcast, and the air damp from the rain that had fallen the night before. My family decided to clean out the attic, a space that had been neglected for years. We rarely had free time, and cleaning seemed like a good idea for such a day. As we began to sift through the old boxes, a strange feeling crept over me. The items inside were familiar, but they carried an unshakable sense of foreboding. Maybe it was the musty smell of time, or just the presence of memories buried for too long. We found an old box filled with photos from past family trips. Pictures of family, friends, camping trips, outdoor picnics, and parties. I hadn't seen these photos since they were taken, and they stirred up mixed emotions. Joy from the past, but also the sorrow of lost time. I remembered those days, those trips my family used to take each summer. We would travel to remote countryside locations where the air was fresh and the quietness offered a perfect escape from the bustling city. As I sat there sorting through the photos, I stopped at one that struck me as odd. It was a picture of us standing by a lake, the bright sunlight reflecting off the water, making the scene look almost alive. But what caught my attention wasn't the scenery. It was a faint figure in the background. A woman, standing a few feet behind us, who none of us recognized. At first, I thought it was just a camera glitch, or perhaps someone passing by at the moment the photo was taken. But as I went through more pictures, that same figure began to appear again and again. Each photo was taken at different locations, and yet the woman was always there, standing somewhere in the distance, obscured in shadows or light, not clear but undeniable. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized that we had never met or noticed this woman during any of our trips. I asked my husband about it, but he couldn't explain it either. Maybe she's just a stranger who happened to be there, he suggested, but I could see the unease in his eyes. These photos had been lying dormant in the attic for years, and now that we had rediscovered them, it felt as though the woman had been waiting for us all along. We started to go through the pictures more carefully. The further we looked, the clearer the figure became in each photo. From faint, ghostly smudges, the shape of the woman gradually sharpened with each frame, until in one final photograph, I froze. The woman wasn't standing far in the background anymore. She was much closer. Her face, though still blurry, was etched with pain and sorrow. I felt a cold draft sweep through me, despite the attic being sealed tight. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Those hollow eyes, her pale skin, and the faint, eerie smile on her lips. There was something about her that filled me with unease. It wasn't a typical kind of fear. It was a deep, primal feeling, as if she were watching, waiting for something from me. The next morning, I decided to investigate the places where we had taken those photos. Things grew even stranger when I realized that all the photos featuring the mysterious woman had been taken in one particular area, a road, a forest, a lakeshore, where we had stopped during one trip a few years ago. The locations were close to each other, and perhaps they held a story we didn't yet understand. As I dug deeper into the history of these places, I uncovered a chilling truth. Years ago, a woman had died in a car accident near those spots. Her car had veered off the road and plunged into the lake while she was driving home one rainy night. No one knew why she had ended up on that road, and her death remained a mystery. I shuddered as I read the details. The woman in the photo, She looked disturbingly similar to the victim of the accident. Could it be her? A restless spirit haunting us through old photos? I tried to convince myself it wasn't possible, but deep down, I knew something was very wrong. The next night, the nightmare came. I found myself standing by the lake shore, the very spot where we had taken the first photo with the ghostly figure. The water was dark, pitch black, with no light reflecting off its surface. And then, from the shadows, she appeared. She didn't speak, just stood there, staring at me with those empty eyes. But I could feel her hatred, her anguish. She wanted something from me. And I knew, whether I wanted to or not, I would have to face the horrifying truth. When I woke from the nightmare, my heart pounded violently in my chest. The dim light from the bedside lamp did nothing to dispel the creeping dread that clung to me. That woman, her face, her dead, empty eyes, her unbearable silence, haunted my every thought. It was as though she was standing in the corner of the room, watching, waiting for me to notice her. All day, I couldn't stop thinking about the photos. They felt like an unspoken warning, a harbinger of something terrible that I hadn't yet understood. I began to feel as if I was being watched, followed by invisible eyes. Wherever I went, whatever I did, I always sensed someone, or something, just behind me, barely out of sight. That afternoon, while I was cooking in the kitchen, the phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice trembled, and I could hear the fear in her tone. "Do you feel strange? Like something's not right?" she asked. I hesitated, trying to find words for the terror that had been gnawing at me. "Did you see her too?" My mother took a deep breath. "I saw her in my dream. That woman, she was standing right in front of me. But she didn't say anything. She just stared, like she was waiting for something." I felt my skin prickle with cold. My mother's nightmare was the same as mine. This couldn't be a coincidence. I knew now that this wasn't just a haunting image stuck in our minds. This was real. It was invading our lives. That evening, I decided to confront the photos once more. I needed to understand more about this woman, why she was appearing in our lives. As I flipped through the pictures again, I noticed something in the one by the lake that I hadn't seen before. Far in the background, there was a glint of light coming from beneath the water's surface, like something shining through the murky depths. The sight reminded me of the car accident. The car that had plunged into the lake on that rainy night, carrying the woman down to her death. Perhaps that was where her body had been lost. In that moment, I decided we had to go back to the lake. I needed to know the truth. I wanted to understand what was haunting us. My husband was furious when I told him about my plan to return to the lake, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. Somehow, I knew this wouldn't stop until I confronted it. Finally, after days of arguing, he agreed to come with me. We drove back to the familiar dirt road that led to the lake, the same road we had taken on our trip years ago. As the car rolled along the muddy path, a light rain began to fall. Everything felt as it had before, but this time, the air was heavier, darker. The sky had dimmed, as though the whole world was sinking into shadow. When we reached the lake, the sense of dread in my chest grew stronger. The lake was still, dark as ink, reflecting the overcast sky above. There wasn't a sound, except for the soft patter of rain. It was too quiet, an unsettling kind of silence. We parked by the shore. Standing there, I could feel the cold air rising off the water. I remembered what I had read about the accident. The car had plunged into the lake on a rainy night just like this, and the woman had never been rescued. Her body was found days later, trapped in the car at the bottom of the lake. I walked to the edge of the water, my eyes fixed on the still surface. The darkness here wasn't just the absence of light. It carried something deeper, a presence I couldn't explain. And then, as if from the ground beneath me, I heard a whisper. At first it was faint, barely audible, but slowly it grew clearer, creeping into my mind. "Help me." I jerked back, looking at my husband, but he showed no sign of hearing anything. He didn't hear the voice. I turned back to the lake, and this time, from the shadows, I saw her. The woman from the photos. She was standing on the surface of the water, only a few meters from me. Her empty eyes, her long, soaked black hair, and her tattered white dress. Her skin was pale, almost waxen, like she hadn't been alive for a very long time. But her eyes were fixed on me, as if pleading for something. "Help me," she repeated, her voice raspy, like it came from somewhere far away. I stumbled back, my heart racing. It wasn't fear, at least not the kind I expected. It was her pain that overwhelmed me, a deep, sorrowful agony that I couldn't begin to understand. She had been trapped here, in this darkness, for so long. No one had helped her, no one had heard her cries. Her soul was bound to this place, caught between life and death. I wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. The darkness around the lake seemed to tighten around me, making it hard to breathe. And then, in an instant, she was gone. Vanished into the air as if she had never been there. Only the soft rain continued to fall, gently rippling the surface of the water. I backed away toward my husband, the cold seeping into my bones. I didn't know what had just happened, but one thing was certain. She wanted something from us. She wanted to be freed. But how? And why us? The questions lingered, unanswered, and I knew this wasn't the end. We had unknowingly stepped into a story where past and present had merged, a world where lost souls couldn't find peace. We had awakened something, a shadow of despair, and now she wouldn't stop until she found the release she sought. The drive home was quiet, but I knew that this was far from over. The woman had left her mark on my mind. She wouldn't rest, wouldn't let go, until she was freed. And the worst part was, I didn't know if we could help her, or if we would become the next shadows in this tragic tale. That night, as I lay in the darkness, the whisper of the lake echoed in my mind, still calling out to me. I knew that sleep would no longer come easily.